So we've talked about the Oceanic, the Atlantic, and the Baltic. Now let's talk about the fourth of the Oceanic-class ships, the Republic. Like all of her sisters, Republic was built at Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Launched on a slipway on July 4th, 1871, she was named in honor of the United States, as her launching date was July 4th. She would be completed the following year, beginning her maiden voyage in February of 1872. Her maiden voyage was less than perfect. During her maiden voyage, she was swamped in a storm, flooding her boiler rooms and significantly damaging the vessel. In this storm, one of the lifeboats was actually very heavily damaged to the point where it was considered a total loss, and one of the crew members was seriously injured. And while the ship made its way to New York, the White Star Line was ultimately forced to reassess their routes. Deciding that 5 ships was enough to operate on the North Atlantic, they moved the Republic to a new route. Seeking to compete with the Inman Line, who was operating routes to South America, they moved the Republic, as well as several other ships, to a Liverpool to Chile route in an effort to capitalize on that market. However, while it was found that the Republic was fairly successful on that route, being one of the largest and most opulent ships operating between Europe and South America, it was found to be not economically feasible, and the ship was quickly pulled from that route just a few years later, returning to the North Atlantic. She would serve on the North Atlantic until 1874, 4 years after the first Oceanic class entered service, at which point the Britannic and the Germanic entered service for the White Star Line. With these 2 newer, more capable ships in service, the Republic was deemed redundant again and once again withdrawn from the North Atlantic, put into a reserve position. This meant that the Republic would basically sit on the sidelines for most of the 1870s, only jumping in when a different ship needed repairs and they needed a ship to basically fill the gap. During that time, though, Republic gained an interesting reputation with passengers who absolutely adored her, calling her a floating palace and one of the most luxurious ships they had ever seen. That being said, many of these passengers had never sailed on other Oceanic-class liners and were simply comparing the Oceanic class to other vessels. During the rest of the 1870s, during her occasional spurts of service, she had a lot of minor incidents. In 1875, she discovered the Norwegian bark Velox, adrift and abandoned at sea. In 1879, she was badly damaged on the Mersey River after a collision with a schooner named the Ocean Queen. Later that same year, in December 1879, she faced heavy seas on the North Atlantic in a storm that was so bad that it actually damaged the top of her funnel. And a year later, in December of 1880, she actually had a major engine failure and had to be towed most of the way to New York by a German liner, which then ran out of coal, and the Republic had to finish the rest of the voyage to New York herself. In 1885, she was leased to the Inman Line very briefly before being returned to the White Star Line, where she once again had another collision. On September 20th, 1885, while sailing in New York Harbor, the Republic, under the command of a harbor pilot, would collide with the Cunard steamer Urania. This collision significantly damaged the Republic and forced her into dry dock in New York, where she was repaired and returned to service. In 1888, she was pulled from service for major overhauls and brought to Harland and Wolff, where she was given a second class and then put back in service on the North Atlantic under the command of Captain Edward Smith, who would later captain Titanic. However, newer, more advanced White Star liners were on the way with the building of the Teutonic and the Majestic. It was quickly becoming clear that the Republic would soon serve no purpose within the White Star Line's fleet, and she was given a finite end date, but she would have one last surprise for the White Star Line. On January 27th, 1888, the ship would ground outside of New York and have to be pulled off of a sandbar to make it into the city. With the arrival of the Teutonic and the Majestic, the White Star Line knew they didn't need the Republic anymore, so they put her up for sale, ultimately selling the ship to the Hamburg America line, who renamed her the Maasdam. Her first voyage as the Maasdam would be on March 15th, 1890, and would begin a relatively successful career with the Hamburg America line, which was, for the most part, incident-free. In the late 1890s, they actually added a stop off in northern France, which would become a pretty standard practice for many shipping lines in Europe in the early 1900s. By 1902, however, she was really starting to show her age, and the Hamburg America line didn't want her anymore, so they sold her off to an Italian line named La Veloce. This Italian line brought her in and gave her another major overhaul, basically pulling out all of her first and second class accommodations to make her a migrant ship carrying entirely steerage passengers. In fact, she could carry up to 1,400 steerage passengers, which was massive for a ship of this size. They initially renamed her the Vittoria before ultimately settling on the name the Città di Napoli, and she began serving this Italian line out of Italy. During this time, she sailed between Genoa, Naples, Gibraltar, and New York, bringing migrants from southern Europe up to the New World. However, by 1907, she was really starting to show her age, and the La Veloce line pulled her from service, but she would have one last job. In the aftermath of the 1908 Messina earthquake, the city de Napoli was loaned to the Italian government to serve as housing for those displaced in the disaster. In 1909, she was returned to the La Veloce line, but not wanting to put her back into service, they ultimately sold her for scrap, and she was scrapped in Genoa in 1910, making her the last surviving member of the Oceanic class, and one of the ones with the longest and most unique careers. If you'd like to learn about some of her sisters and their stories, I'll leave a link up here to a playlist I have all about the other ships of the Oceanic class and the class as a whole. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Barbette and Binnacle, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.